As we head into the colder season, one of the most common questions I get is how to keep my chickens safe and healthy throughout the winter months. But when you search this question, there are so many answers out there, and some are completely opposite from one another, and to be honest, some are also very far from the truth. So in this video today, I will be sharing 5 must-have chicken keeping tips for winter, no matter where you live. Hi there, I'm Audrey, and I help passion-driven people trailblaze their way to a more self-sufficient life filled with happiness, plants, and chickens. If you currently have chickens or are thinking about getting chickens for the first time, I know that your first priority is doing what is best for them. But it's also very important to remember that chickens can naturally and instinctively survive and thrive without our intervention. Of course, there's things that we need to do like feed them and water them and such when we have them cooped up. But there are things that we could do even with good intentions that are actually harmful to them. And that leads me to tip number 1, which is to not provide supplemental heating. The most important reason for this is that chickens naturally grow in feathers that they need to survive in the weather that they are living in. So if it's starting to get cold, their bodies know that, and they're going to grow in all of the feathers that they naturally need. So if we provide them with supplemental heating, their bodies are actually tricked into thinking that it's warmer than it really is, and they don't grow in the feathers that they actually need. And making their bodies dependent on that heat is not good, first of all, because the power could go out, which means the heat is then gone. There's also unsafe forms of heat, like certain heat lamps that can catch fire. And then it's also unsafe because when those chickens go outside, they're obviously away from the supplemental heating and their bodies are going to be cold. But please also take note that this is referring to mature chickens that have their feathers. If you have baby chicks, they do need a heat lamp until their feathers have fully grown in. And so this is just referring to older chickens that have all of their feathers grown in. And now on to tip number 2, which is making sure there are no drafts of air that are flowing directly onto your chickens. For example, flowing onto your hens while they're in the nesting boxes laying eggs, or flowing onto your chickens at night as they're roosting. Chicken coops do need good ventilation, and so by saying there should be no drafts of air does not mean that everything should be closed up tight. And we'll be covering the ventilation in the next tip, but you just want to make sure there's no cold drafts of air flowing directly onto the areas where your chickens are roosting, nesting, hanging out. They should be able to get away from the air and be huddled together at night to keep warm without cold drafts of air flowing directly onto them. You can see here that I have vents way up high in my chicken coop, and I also have these windows that are covered, and we don't have very harsh winters, and so I'm not worried about my chickens getting too cold. And the nesting boxes and roosts are actually lower than these windows are, but if I lived somewhere that was much colder, I would put shutters over the windows to make sure that they could be closed up. Tip number 3 is to make sure the coop stays dry. Chickens can handle cold temperatures, much more colder than you think, actually, but it's the condensation and the moisture that can cause issues. So you need to be sure that your coop has good enough ventilation that it can dry out inside, but make sure the drafts of air aren't flowing directly onto your chickens. It's also really important to keep your coop as clean as possible. Tip number 4, which really just depends on your climate, is to keep a heated waterer. For myself, I don't have to do that because we live in such a mild area where we do sometimes get a freeze and the water will slightly freeze over, but it melts away so quickly I'm not worried. But if you live somewhere with a harsh winter, a heated waterer is really going to come in handy. You don't want to have to worry about going out to your coop multiple times a day to check your chicken's water to make sure it's not frozen, and you don't want them going too long without water. And so at least having a heated waterer will give you that peace of mind that they can go a while without your intervention. And if it does happen to break or go out, you will have time to give them water, but for the majority of the time, you know that they will have water that's not frozen. And now, last but not least, is to raise chickens that are bred for your climate. We have pretty mild winters here, but we have really hot summers, and so I've always kept a mix of lots of different chicken breeds, but what I really have to worry about is the heat in the summertime. I don't ever have to really worry about our winter cold, and truthfully, chickens can actually tolerate the cold temperatures much easier than they can the extreme heat. But there are definitely breeds out there that are much better suited for the cold weather. And so if you live in an area with really harsh winters, I would suggest raising breeds that are bred for the cold weather, such as Brahmas, Cochins, and Faveroles. And one of the features that you can look at on a chicken is their comb. Chickens that have really large combs, like the white leghorn, the buff Orpington, breeds like that, they are much more prone to frostbite. But if you look at chickens that have a much smaller comb, they are less prone to frostbite, and so they are much better suited for the cold weather. And depending on when you are watching this video, it's very likely that your chickens just went through molt, or they may even still be molting. And one of my most favorite treats to feed my chickens to help them grow back in their feathers is black oiled sunflower seeds. They are high in protein, and they're just a great treat to feed your chickens in general, but especially during molting season. And so if you head to this video right here, I will be covering the benefits much more in depth and talk about where you can find them. And so head to that video next, and I will see you there.